music as a form of social control. If you're listening to music that you didn't intend to hear, then chances are it's been designed for your manipulation.
There are three primary historical connections that tie the mob into the music scene.
He did his first album, I did Usher's first album. I don't have legal guardianship of him, but for the next 48 hours, he's with me. So, and we gonna go full crazy.
We're going crazy.
Crazy.
And therefore, I said Glaucon. Musical training is a more potent instrument than any other, because rhythm and harmony find their way into the inward places of the soul, on which they mightily fasten, imparting grace, and making the soul of him who is rightly educated graceful, or of him who is ill-educated ungraceful, and also because he who has received this true education of the inner being will most shrewdly perceive omissions or faults in art and nature, and with a true taste, while he praises and rejoices over and receives into his soul the good, and becomes noble and good, he will justly blame and hate the bad, now in the days of his youth, even before he is able to know the reasons why. And when reason comes, he will recognize and salute the friend with whom his education has made him long familiar. Thus, much of music, which makes a fair ending, for what should be the end of music, if not the love of beauty? Hey everybody, Marcus here. Those who have followed my channel know I am a musician these days. During the 6 years of my absence from this channel, I devoted the last 3.5 of them to focus full-time on music. When the muses sleep, I take breaks for other activities, this channel being one of them. Today's will be another one of those watch-along videos. The subject is Muzak. Muzak is the soundtrack of hell. It is the audible version of the banality of evil. What I'm going to put forward in this video will be a roller coaster of crazy, all right. Most of you will encounter information here I highly doubt you have ever heard of before about music, the music industry, the use of music for social engineering as a weapon of war, and of course, torture. So, buckle up and let's get started. We got a lot of ground to cover.
This is a story about the persuasive power of music and the effect it has on the collective unconscious. It's a story of war, of mind control, and of half-price sales at the Kmart. Welcome to Ordinary Things, where ordinary things are explained. Today's ordinary thing? Muzak, the soundtrack to mid-century elevators and prefrontal lobotomies. But what is Muzak? The genre known as Muzak is a style of instrumental background music, characterized by repetition and simple arrangements inspired by classical or popular songs. Also known as elevator music or piped music, it's designed to be played in commercial spaces with the expressed purpose of altering people's mood and behavior. So where did Muzak come from? Much like Xeroxing, jet skis and onesies, we know Muzak by the name of the company that created it. The Muzak company was founded in 1922 by a man named George Square. Before inflicting soft jazz on the unsuspecting public, Square had an illustrious career with the world's biggest military and the Middle East's worst wedding crashers, the US Army. In World War I, he devised a way to transmit secret radio messages using living trees as antennae. After the war, he swapped trees for telephones, as the Muzak company's first product was a device that sent music through telephone lines, charging customers monthly on their utility bill. But the service was soon eclipsed by developments in radio technology, and because who'd want to pay a monthly fee just to listen to music on their phone? So it wasn't until the 1940s that the Muzak company found its true, irritating purpose. What you're hearing now is Paradise Program, recorded by Muzak's in-house orchestra. It's energetic but bland, motivational yet mundane. It's the kind of music that might inspire you to do your taxes or take the bins out. And it was also a fixture in Muzak's highly successful stimulus progression program. By 1936, Muzak was selling the idea that background music could substantially increase productivity in the workplace. They began producing packages of motivational music designed to be pumped into factories and offices. These recordings were organized into alternating 15-minute blocks of music and silence. 15 minutes of progressively energetic music designed to encourage work and concentration, followed by 15 minutes of silence to prevent what they called musical fatigue. and to stop workers from stuffing industrial tools in their ears. This was stimulus progression, and it became an extremely popular idea during the manufacturing boom of World War II. American military services enjoyed virtually unchecked control over their spending, so manufacturers were certain they could sell their products, and lots of them. Their only challenge was keeping their workforce efficient and making sure they had enough pockets to stuff all their cash into. Muzak's promise of a magic productivity playlist took off, and soon every factory floor in America was alive with the sound of Muzak. But then, a man named Hitler ruined the fun for everyone by blowing his brains across a bunker wall. Factory-owning fat cats were left wondering who was going to buy all their mass-produced crap when they weren't living in a war economy anymore. But luckily, the Muzak company had an answer for that too. Muzak in the 1950s was a lot like Joe Rogan now. No one really liked it or listened to it before, but suddenly it was fucking everywhere. This was because Muzak's best-paid pseudoscientists made an excellent and persuasive case that music could have a powerful effect on shoppers. This is Holiday for Strings, originally composed by David Ross and re-recorded by Seberg, one of Muzak's main competitors. It's slow, slightly unnerving to modern ears, but essentially the oral equivalent of wallpaper. It's music that doesn't draw attention to itself, and this was the point. Retail Muzak was designed to work on a subliminal level. Studies showed that slow-paced, inoffensive music encouraged shoppers to linger longer in store. Muzak called this dwell time for shoppers to make more impulse purchases and behave like the consumerist cattle we all know we are. You're a good little drone, aren't you? Now do a dance. Do it. Good boy. Some department stores took the subliminal Muzak philosophy a step further by installing little black boxes that mixed music with barely audible anti-theft messages that would repeat 9,000 times an hour. Now, was all this strictly legal? The answer is absolutely. It was. Still is. But luckily, modern audiences are much too sophisticated to fall for anything like that.
Okay, let me fill in some missing pieces to the story so far. In 1922, 57-year-old U.S. Major General George Squier founds a company called Wired Radio, whose goal was to deliver music direct to consumer via telephone. By 1934, the proliferation of radio invalidates his original business model. Squier rebrands Wired Radio to Muzak, with a shift in business model away from direct-to-consumer and towards commercial businesses, namely, to target wide swaths of listeners simultaneously by getting businesses to play his music in a public setting. There was a growing interest in workforce psychology in the 1930s. The concept of ergonomics started to emerge in the workplace. Businesses were finding ways to humanize work areas to increase productivity. On a similar note, studies began to emerge on the effects of music on human psychology. A study from Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey showed that music in the workplace reduced absenteeism and worker turnover in employees by a significant margin. Around the same time, musicologists like Paul Nettle and Theodore Adorno were studying the effects of music as well. This growing interest in the science behind music, especially when concerned with its effects on the workforce, helped Muzak gain traction. Closer to today's time, IBM had conducted additional studies where it found music to be effective on increasing productivity of menial workers. It found the opposite on knowledge workers, especially for software developers, their primary focus group. Music is processed mostly by the right side of the brain. Knowledge work tends to be left brain dominant. However, developers who listened to music while writing code were found to have significantly fewer eureka moments of brilliance in terms of solutions that they would put against the problems that they were facing in code. Music appears to, distract the right side of the brain, causing fewer bouts of genuine creativity, even though the tasks at hand were predominantly left-brained. So, here's your first takeaway, boys and girls. If you desire to tap into your full creative potential, create in silence. Now, we need to take a little detour from Muzak. In 1947, the CIA is founded. In 1953, the CIA starts its MK-Ultra program, a program declassified only in 2001, whose purpose was to develop novel mind control techniques. The research heavily focused on the use of drugs, specifically LSD, various forms of abuse, humiliation, and of course sensory experiments like visual and audio-related interrogation techniques. MK-Ultra was staffed by ex-Nazi researchers who were brought to the US post-World War II in what is called Operation Paperclip. Okay, now let's get back to Muzak. In the 1950s, Muzak began heavily investing into research of behavioral manipulation techniques through their stimulus progression program. Research based on works, amongst many, from the previously mentioned Theodor Adorno, a leading member of the Frankfurt School, avid socialist author, and CIA-sponsored magazine contributor. The Frankfurt School is well known to have been causal in a great deal of social movements during the 20th century. With the company Muzak having a virtual monopoly of commercial music play in public spaces, including elevators, I'm sure they had a lot of observational data to draw from to correctly tailor their sound to achieve the changes in behavior that they were designing for their customers.
Most famously, Muzak was also pumped into elevators. Well, we're all used to elevators now, but when they were first introduced, people saw them for what they were: flying domiciles of disequilibrium with the ability to malfunction and turn you into human soup. Background music soothed elevator riders, alleviated boredom, and made accidental eye contact with other passengers less awkward. At its peak, Muzak boasted over 100 million daily listeners/victims. It was pumped into restaurants, into ocean liners, and into my recurring nightmare where I'm chased down a never-ending corridor by Alex Jones's pulsating face. But it also made it to the White House. In 1953, President Eisenhower made his contribution to the musical industrial complex by wiring the White House for Muzak.
Sounds about right. 1953, White House, Muzak, MKUltra.
And President Kennedy was piping those slow jams on Air Force One. Well, when he wasn't piping Hollywood starlets and White House staffers. And Lyndon B. Johnson loved Muzak almost as much as he loved shitting with the door open, as he actually owned a Muzak franchise in Austin before he was president. Muzak even made it into outer space, as NASA played it on the Apollo missions as a way to calm astronauts during takeoff. So while we may imagine the moon mission sounding like this, they probably sounded more like this. But Muzak was a victim of its own success, and the public started to turn against the genre in that culturally quiet and rarely discussed decade of the 1960s. By the late 1960s, Muzak became a punchline for anything generic and uninspired, especially because popular music had become a vehicle for radical social change, revolution, and not washing your hair. Muzak was literally the sound of the establishment. It was not designed for the enjoyment of listeners, but for their manipulation. It was music made for the benefit of the person who was playing it. It's like the guy who brings his acoustic guitar to the house party. It doesn't matter how well he plays, everyone's still gonna think he's a knob.
Okay, now we are into the 1960s, the year we see some solid additions to the 27 Club, a club composed of mostly musicians who tragically died at the age of 27. This club includes the likes of Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Rolling Stones founder Brian Jones, and more recently, Kurt Cobain. Personally, I do not believe there is any curse on musicians that dooms them at 27. However, the membership list of this club is quite impressive. The Vietnam War started in 1955. Rock and roll was brewing in the background of American culture. Elvis broke into stardom between 1956 and 1958. Not too long after, we had Beatlemania from 1963 to 1966. Rock stars, with their anti-establishment revolutionary message, boosted by the fame only the relatively recent widespread adoption of television could have brought about, were becoming something of a nuisance to the establishment. You see, a lot of things emerged all at the same time. You had youth culture emerging in the 1950s, which intersected with the television set, which intersected with rock and roll. Rebellious kids now had a rebellious form of music, which made these rock artists much bigger than they could have been in the radio era. There's just something very humanizing and connecting in seeing the musicians physically, which greatly contributes to fanaticism. A fandom that was to that point contained to movie stars on the big screen. By the way, the word fan is just the short form of fanatic. These rebellious rock bands amassed considerable followings. The backdrop was one of the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, anti-war protests, drugs, the JFK assassination, Malcolm X's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, Robert Kennedy's assassination, and other counterculture movements. The youth were uncontrollable, and an enormous contributor to the political turmoil were these uppity rock bands. Keep in mind, however, rock and roll precedes the 1960s. The music came prior to the social upheaval. In 1967, the CIA started a secret domestic espionage program targeting political dissent within the US, codenamed Chaos. Among their targets were overt political groups like the Black Panthers, but musicians were on the hit list as well. It made sense to target rock bands, as rock bands commanded the ears of tens of millions of angsty youth, ears which were being filled with political messages. In his book, The Covert War Against Rock, Albert Constantine follows the evidence around the deaths of several well-known musicians. He points to disturbing evidence suggesting mob-assisted CIA assassinations of the likes of figures such as, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, Bob Marley, John Lennon, and several others. It has generally been understood that the mob has always played a major role within the music business. Frank Sinatra was obviously mob-connected and installed by the mob. In the movie The Godfather, there's an obvious reference to Sinatra in the character of the struggling actor who asks the Don to help him secure a movie role. This in turn leads to the infamous scene of the decapitated horse head in the bed of the movie producer. Now, I do not intend to repeat the content of Albert's book. What I want to point out is the CIA's meddling. Groups like the Rolling Stones were directly involved in creating political upheaval consequent to their music. Brian Jones, one of the 27 Club and founding member of the Stones, was murdered by the CIA. His official cause of death is listed as drowning, yet a deathbed confession emerged from a witness decades later who testified to seeing the murder take place. This witness was of course threatened with the same fate as he was seen by the assassins during the assassination. Numerous stories are scattered in the book of the CIA setting up scenarios to entrap musicians. In most cases, an agent would be used to create a scenario in which musicians would be caught with drugs or otherwise led to perform some sort of crime. These setups are of course referred to as entrapment and are illegal to perform. However, CIA. The objective was to silence these musicians' political messaging one way or another. Jim Morrison being another musician who was silenced one way or another. The fame these rock artists enjoyed was unprecedented, and the government had not yet consolidated their power over the music business. As such, uppity artists were still able to break through into the mainstream consciousness with unfiltered messaging in their music.
The idea that the mafia controls or has controlled the music business is rooted in a combination of historical connections, payola scandals, which we will discuss more in detail, and what I would describe as the cash-focused ambiguity of the entertainment business overall. There are three primary historical connections that tie the mob into the music scene. Number one, the mob's historical involvement in nightclubs and venues. Number two, the mob's connections to record label executives. And three, the mob's infiltration into artist management. There was also a risk for the artist because they had very little to absolutely no say in their work conditions or pay, or what they could even play. Now, earlier I mentioned the Cotton Club in Harlem. One of the most notable figures in jazz, Duke Ellington, performed regularly at this club in the 1920s. Louis Armstrong was also from this era. Fats Waller, a jazz pianist and composer who was reportedly kidnapped by gangsters and forced to perform at a party, was also from this era, as was Bessie Smith, and many others who got their notoriety from playing these venues in the 20s. Now, Columbia Records saw the growing jazz scene in the 1920s and wanted to take advantage of it. Although Columbia Records was founded in 1887, they recorded some of the earliest jazz and blues music in the 1920s. While there's no direct link, of course, to Columbia Records and the mob, we can look at the timeline of the evolution of Columbia Records and their jazz music and make some observations. For one thing, Columbia Records was located at 55 Liberty Street in New York City. The building housed Columbia's corporate offices as well as its recording studios. And this was about 30 minutes from Tammany Hall and Webster Hall, and just 15 minutes from where the 5 Points Gang was founded and had their primary operations hub. A man named Ted Wallerston held a lot of influence in Columbia's operations during the 1920s. He eventually became president in 1939, but in the 1920s, he was primarily responsible for the sales and marketing of Columbia Records. He played a crucial role in Columbia's market reach and the record label's ability to reach a wider audience. He was also networking a lot on the jazz scene and in these nightclubs. It was under Ted's leadership that several jazz artists were signed to the label in the 1920s, and also under his leadership that Columbia Records bought out OK Records in 1926, spelled O-K-E-H, which is arguably when the growing control the mafia supposedly had or has over the music industry really amped up, because many of the artists who were playing gigs in these mafia-owned nightclubs had been signed and had been recording at OK Records. Most notably, Louis Armstrong, who played at the Cotton Club in Harlem, King Oliver, Clarence Williams, Bessie Smith, all part of that Harlem Renaissance scene in these Manhattan jazz clubs in the 20s. The mafia felt as though they had kind of already marked their territory, so to speak, with a lot of these artists, having them played residencies in their nightclubs. And after all, if you were an artist playing in a mafia-owned nightclub in the 1920s, you might know too much. You might know too much. So when these artists started recording with OK Records or Columbia or any other record label who wanted to capitalize off the jazz age, the mafia really wasn't going to just let this happen without maintaining some kind of control over the artists and what the artists knew about them, essentially. So the mafia started to infiltrate the sales channels the record labels were utilizing to distribute their records. They started finding out who the record label was sending their albums to for distribution to the public, and then they'd go after those distributors and use their same old tactics of intimidation, bribery, and other threats to ensure the distributors only sold and distributed to the places the mafia wanted those albums to be sold. Now, this whole concept of the mafia controlling which albums and songs got out there laid down the roots for what would eventually become known as payola practices. Payola practices didn't come into play until later, once the radio had evolved, and the mafia was then accused of controlling which songs got radio airplay, again by using the same tactics of intimidation, bribery, blackmail, etc. The same tactics they used on small business owners in Manhattan, on record label distributors, on anybody, political opponents. Now, it's important to emphasize and stress that there are no direct, tangible, black and white recorded ties between OK Records or Columbia Records or any other record label and the mafia. However, the label's success in promoting jazz and blues artists during the 1920s meant that their records were likely part of the mafia-controlled jukebox operations and distribution networks. Now, the mafia's involvement in jukebox operations and record distribution meant that a portion of the profits from record sales likely flowed back to these organized crime gangs. And this created a system where the success of certain records could be tied directly to the mafia's ability to push them through their own controlled channels. So now, not only is the mafia supplying illegal alcohol, prostitutes, operating brothels, intimidating political opponents and voters, participating in election fraud to get certain political outcomes, bribing and intimidating judges, but now they are also controlling artist sale distributions and jukebox operations all throughout, primarily, at least for the 1920s, New York City and Chicago. So it's only natural for the mafia that they infiltrate themselves further into the lives and careers of these artists and delve deeper into directly managing these artists and booking them for live performances outside of their own nightclubs. And throughout the 1930s, that's exactly what members of the mafia did. They started using protection rackets to gain control over bigger, more legitimate music venues. They'd ask these venue owners to pay them a certain lump sum of money, and if they didn't, they threatened to vandalize their venue, set it on fire. They'd threaten violence against the venue owner and their family. Again, the exact same tactics used to get the political voting outcomes that the Democratic Party wanted, and the same tactics used against all of the small business owners and record label distributors in the 1900s in Manhattan. I mean, it's their same wash, rinse, repeat routine. This time they're going after big live music venues for big concerts. concerts. And guess what? It worked. It worked every time. It worked for decades, and it was working for these larger performing venues too. Not only did the venue owner have to agree to pay the mob off, but they also had to agree, in many cases, to let frontmen for the mafia invest in or manage these venues directly. These frontmen would be perfectly clean cut in a suit, look totally legitimate, and they would then own a part of the venue and would operate these venues fully or partially on behalf of the mafia while providing this front that they are a completely legitimate businessman. And in return, the mafia would also get a piece of the pie from the venue's profits. In some cases, the mafia was nicer to the venue owner and would form a genuine business partnership. They really only did that if they really liked the guy and thought he would be really willing to participate. These partnerships were mutually beneficial. The mafia provided financial backing and protection and access to alcohol, while the venue owners offered a very legitimate front for the mafia's activities and allowed them to book whichever artist they wanted to. And which artist the mafia wanted to book was dependent on several factors. Oftentimes, it was whoever they genuinely thought would draw the biggest crowd. Sometimes it was dependent on who the manager for that artist was and what connections the manager had to the mafia members owning and controlling that venue. Many times, too, the mafia would draft up exclusive contracts with the artists. Sometimes the artists wouldn't even have a choice but to sign these contracts. They'd be forced to do so. Or worse, the artist would sign something willingly, not fully reading it and not understanding what they were signing into. The mafia's involvement in the live venue space really solidified after Prohibition was reversed in 1933. The reversal of Prohibition meant they had to start focusing more and more on legitimate business operations. So not only did they continue to grow and work on their live venue controls, they also got further into talent management in the 1930s. This way, they could cut out the middleman of the artist manager, and everyone was connected and on the same team. Now, of course, it would be cumbersome and slow-moving to target singular artists one at a time, so the mafia decided they would just start infiltrating talent agencies that had portfolios of artists and managed several of them at a time. They're sitting there thinking, why didn't we do this sooner? It's so obvious. It's so simple. The talent agencies are responsible for everything from A to Z, the managing of the artist, the booking of their performances, their recordings and their appearances, their PR, everything. By gaining control over these talent agencies, the mafia could influence which artists received opportunities and how much they were paid. The mafia often used frontmen, again at these talent agencies, to look like legitimate business people, and this allowed them to operate behind the scenes while maintaining a degree of separation. Now, artists managed by mafia-controlled agencies often found themselves locked into long-term contracts that, at the end of the day, really did nothing but exploit them. These contracts typically favored the management company, with artists receiving only a small portion of their earnings. The mafia would take a significant cut of their profits, often leaving the artist with very little financial gain. Any artist who resisted signing these contracts or who attempted to break free from them faced intimidation, threats, and even violence. The mafia used its reputation for ruthlessness to ensure compliance, leaving artists with few options but to accept the terms. The mafia's influence extended to record labels and recording studios in the 1940s. This way, they could continue to grow their control over the production and distribution of an artist's work. This allowed them to manipulate the success of artists they managed by ensuring that their record received airplay and distribution, often in exchange for a share of profits. Enter those payola practices I mentioned a few minutes ago, the practice of paying for radio airplay. And this became more and more prevalent in the 1940s and 1950s, all the way up arguably until recent days. Throughout the 1940s, they maintained their control over nightclubs as well, and despite the exploitative nature of these relationships, the mafia's involvement in artist management contributed to the success of many prominent artists, most notably from the 1940s being Frank Sinatra. Now, through the 40s and 50s, these operations did nothing but continue to grow. The mafia often used the music industry as a means to launder other money from other illegal activities, including gambling and trafficking, and extortion. Record labels, management companies, and concert promotions provided a legitimate front for these operations, as it was ambiguous and primarily cash-based, and still is.
The CIA, once having taken enough control over organized crime, in turn began gaining influence over the mob-controlled record business. Up to this point, the mob was only focused on controlling music production and distribution. Well, of course, and the venues and artist management and pretty much everything, but side issue. Messaging in the music itself was never really much of concern to the mob, however, other than, of course, what the artists knew about them, then it was of a lot of concern. But beyond that, usually the artists had freedom. But through CIA influence, messaging in the music became a subject of control. Early signs of warfare against the public via music started to take place. One of the alumni of the MKUltra experiments was Robert Hunter, associate and close connection to Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead. The Grateful Dead are speculated to have been a plant within the hippie movement. The CIA was testing LSD as part of their mind control experiments on the unsuspecting public. This was referred to as Operation Midnight Climax. LSD was intended to pacify the communist revolutionaries. The Grateful Dead, though topically anti-establishment, were mostly leading their followers into a lifestyle of LSD-induced apathy. Now, I am not suggesting the Grateful Dead were hired help per se. They were a band propped up by the CIA because the message naturally emerging from the Grateful Dead's music and attitude was suitable to the objectives of the CIA. There are plenty of people who want to break through in music. One form of control of messaging in music is to give out the opportunities to those who already embody the message you want to spread. Give them the record deals, pay for their recordings, pay for their marketing. Then let nature take its course. However, since the 1960s, the government has developed far better control mechanisms over messaging in music. Firstly, rock music has been killed off outright. Once a rebellious form of music, it was slowly corrupted through promotion of things like cross-dressing glam of the 80s, then eventually replaced with hip-hop, rap, boy bands, until we end up with what we call popular music today. The last rock star was Kurt Cobain. Since Kurt, there's not been a single person who has reached such heights of fame within the genre. Sure, many non-rock artists have reached that fame, but not rock artists. The rock star is basically dead. And though rock music will never disappear, its presence in the mainstream is long gone. If it were to re-emerge in the mainstream, however, it will be a neutered form of pacified effeminacy with electric guitars. Okay, back to the movie.
The company remained on life support for decades until finally declaring bankruptcy in 2009, where it was subsumed by Mood Media 2 years later. But where the company faltered, its sound emigrated and evolved. It could be argued that the emergence of the ambient electronic genre in the 1970s was a direct consequence of Muzak's influence. The godfather of ambient and human drumstick, Brian Eno, actually cites Muzak as a sort of anti-inspiration for his seminal, insomnia-curing opus, Music for Airports. And a stable of ambient musicians have continued to blur the boundary between music and noise ever since. Aphex Twin, Tangerine Dream, Gorilla Kidney, Fila Brasilia, the list goes on, and I only made one of those up. Muzak itself took a long time to fall out of fashion in Japan, and this partly explains its ubiquitous presence in video games. It appears on the in-game iPod of Metal Gear Solid 4 and as literal elevator music in the N64 classic GoldenEye. And then of course there's the iconic buy mode from The Sims, and really this is the perfect post-Muzak application of the Muzak sound. It's the soundtrack for the accumulation of virtual consumer products, specifically designed for your dopamine-addled drone brain as it goes about conducting a series of microtransactions as a substitute for any real tangible achievements. And my god, isn't it beautiful. And then of course there's the Wii Shop music, which if you've spent more than 6 seconds on the internet, needs no introduction. But beyond its sound, Muzak's lasting skid mark on the pant of society was its philosophy. In the 1990s, the Ailing Company did what it did best: sell jargon to gullible executives with deep pockets. They coined the term quantum modulation, which meant absolutely nothing, but they told people it was about matching music to the needs of specific commercial environments. Companies like Music Concierge and Mood Media continue this legacy as leaders in the booming background music business, or experiential design if you like the smell of your own farts. They design music collections for retail environments that encourage consumer behaviour and attract the store's desired demographics. So while The Gap will play inoffensive pop music to appeal to its broad audience, Urban Outfitters will play something for a younger, trendier crowd. And Hollister will play slowed-down nursery rhymes to attract their lucrative simpleton market. Well, it's lucrative when they can remember their credit card number. Classical music is often deployed tactically. It's played in upmarket restaurants because people associate it with quality and are therefore more likely to spend more money. And in the UK, it's frequently deployed in public spaces where drunk people are known to congregate, as it pacifies and relaxes them. Fast food establishments pick their playlists carefully as well, using high-tempo music to encourage fast customer turnaround. That way, patrons can fill their faces with carbs and corn syrup and go have their heart attack somewhere sufficiently far away from the premises. That is, if they can waddle away fast enough. And this is Muzak's real legacy. Music as a form of social control. If you're listening to music that you didn't intend to hear, then chances are it's been designed for your manipulation. And it's inescapable. It's everywhere, from restaurants, to hotel lobbies, to YouTube videos.
Music is more powerful than reason in the soul. That is also why Plato made music the very first step in his long educational curriculum. Good music was to create the harmony of soul that would be a ripe field for the higher harmony of reason to take root in later. And that is also why he said that the decay of the ideal state would begin with a decay in music. In fact, one of your obscure modern scholars has shown that social and political revolutions have usually been preceded by musical revolutions, and why another sage said, "Let me write the songs of a nation, and I care not who writes its laws." This is Muzak's real legacy, music designed to manipulate you. The reason I played this video for you is not to learn about some company set up in the 1920s that was dishing out soft jazz to play in elevators. It was about giving a name to all the garbage out there being passed off as music today. Cardi B is Muzak. Taylor Swift is Muzak. All those mumble rappers are Muzak. Pretty much every single pop artist is Muzak these days. Why? Because it's either meant to demoralize you through degenerate imagery and lyrics, or it's meant to shift your attention away from anything of any substance. How is Taylor Swift Muzak? Because she's a degenerating force. She's a mid-30s childless, unmarried woman who repeats a single message to her predominantly teen female fan base. Relationships don't work. They don't last. They always end in heartbreak. This is a woman whose entire career is predicated on singing about her failed relationships. Now, I don't think I need to explain why pretty much all of hip-hop and rap is Muzak these days. The encouragement of drug use being one of the reasons. It's actually funny. Up until like 2014, the rap scene was messaging dealing drugs. Then it switched to using drugs. And I'm not talking about the genre here. It's not rap that's degenerate as a genre. It's today's superstars in the genre who are degenerate. Tupac, who many consider the peak of the genre, was after all gunned down. Why? Because he had something to say. Today, you need to be a degenerate to be allowed to be a superstar. The P. Diddy drama is further evidence. For those not familiar with that situation, let me quickly bring you up to speed. P. Diddy, previously named Puff Daddy, is a rapper turned producer. He was a major player and gatekeeper in the rap scene until recently. So far, over 100 accusers have come forward against him. But beyond the sexual accusations, what's more important to our discourse is his role as gatekeeper. If you are to be allowed to become massively famous, as in given the active support and financing by a label, in many cases you need to be willing to put yourself in a compromising situation which will be videotaped for the purposes of future blackmail, just in case you start to have ideas of your own about what sort of messaging you want to send out to your audience. If the artist still gets too uppity, the evidence ought to be enough to discredit them in the eyes of their fan base and therefore sink them into irrelevance. With a lot of top rappers, that means they need to volunteer to be filmed having gay sex. Sometimes there are minors involved. The worse the dirt on you, the more secure your stardom, because the stronger the axe that sits over your head. For those who do not volunteer, well, P. Diddy would make arrangements to ensure such evidence came into being. This practice is also on display in the movie The Godfather. the scene where the senator is drugged in a brothel and then made to believe he murdered a prostitute. Remember, the music business is mob-controlled. Naturally, mob tactics will exist, and blackmail, usually involving minors, is a reliable tool. Justin Bieber was one of P. Diddy's alumni, by the way. Make of that what you will.
So check this out, yo. Justin, you ever seen the movie 48 Hours? Right now, he's having 48 hours with Diddy, him and his boy. They're having the times of their lives, where we hanging out and what we doing. We can't really disclose, but it's definitely a 15-year-old's dream. I have been given custody of him. He signed to Usher. I'm signed to Usher. I had legal guardianship of Usher when he did his first album. I did Usher's first album. I don't have legal guardianship of him, but for the next 48 hours, he's with me. So and we gonna go full crazy.
We're going crazy.
Crazy.
Have you ever wondered why so many famous pop stars seem to go insane with time? It's not just the pressure of touring and the alienating effect of fame. It's also their conscience. It's not universal, but more than enough are guilty. The saying goes that it's not what you know, but who you know. Well, in music, it's not just who you know, it's also how guilty you are willing to be. Muzak is a psychological weapon. Its intent is social control. Good music does exist. It can be found. But it will never be spoon-fed to you like pop music is, nor will it be allowed to grow to meaningful influence. Since pop music definitionally is popular, the short form pop standing for the word popular, you can only expect degeneracy or distraction from pop acts. In the book, The Secret Power of Music, David Tame writes, whenever, at any time during the course of his life, modern man has listened to music, has he really known the meaning and the implications of what he was doing? Certainly not according to the ancient philosophers. We may take ancient China, for example. Each year, in the second month, Emperor Shun could be found journeying eastward in order to check upon his kingdom and to ensure that everything was in order throughout the vast land. Yet, he did not do so by auditing the account books of the different regions, neither by observing the state of life of the populace or by receiving petitions from them, nor by interviewing the regional officials. No, by none of these methods. For in ancient China, there is considered to be a much more revealing, accurate, and scientific method of checking on the state of the nation. According to the ancient Chinese text, Shu King, the Emperor Shun went about through the different territories and tested the exact pitch of the notes of music. If the emperor wished to monitor the efficiency of the central government, what did he do? Get expert advice on policy making? Review the economy? Or the state of popular opinion? While the emperor was not ignorant of any of the above methods, and at times may have taken recourse to all of them, but most importantly, he believed, was to listen to and check the 5 notes of the ancient Chinese musical scale. He had the 8 kinds of Chinese musical instruments brought before him and played by musicians. Then he listened to the local folk songs and also to the tunes which were sung in the court itself, checking that all this music was in perfect correspondence with the 5 tones. Primitive superstition? Well, certainly Emperor Shun did not believe so. According to the philosophy of the ancient Chinese, music was the basis of everything. In particular, they believed that all civilizations are shaped and molded according to the kind of music performed by its people. Was a civilization's music wistful or romantic? Then the people themselves would be romantic. Was it strong and military? Then the nation's neighbors had better beware. Furthermore, a civilization remained stable and unchanged as long as its music remained unchanged. But to change the style of music which people listened to would inevitably lead to a change in the very way of life itself. If Emperor Shun, on his travels about the land, discovered that the instruments of the different territories were all differently tuned, then he would have considered it a grave omen, a foregone conclusion that the territories themselves would begin to deviate from one another if they did not do so already. They might even lose their unity and begin to squabble amongst themselves unless the tuning was at once corrected and made uniform from one place to another. And if the music he heard performed in the villages had become of a vulgar and immoral kind, then the emperor would have expected immorality itself to sweep the nation unless something was done to correct the music. In a book based upon this very thesis, that music shapes consciousness in society, Scott expressed his belief that wherever the greatest variety of musical styles has obtained, there the adherence to tradition and custom has been proportionately less marked, and where musical styles are limited, as for the instance of, say, China, adherence to, nay, even worship of, tradition obtains to a marked degree. We are fully aware that in stating this, we would seem to be lending weight to the prevalent notion that styles of music are merely the outcome and expression of some civilizations' and nations' feelings. That is to say, that the civilization came first and its characteristic species of music afterwards. But an examination of history proves the truth to be exactly the reverse. An innovation in musical style has invariably been followed by an innovation in politics and morals. And, what is more, the decline of music in Egypt and Greece was followed by the complete decline of the Egyptian and Grecian civilizations themselves. Again, one cannot help but note the possible vital importance of this in your subject. When Cyril Scott writes, "An innovation in musical style has invariably been followed by an innovation in politics and morals," one thinks immediately of the vast waves of moral and political change which have swept the Western world since the early 1960s. It seems virtually indisputable that these waves of change began with the appearance on the scene of a new subculture and lifestyle among the young, which was definitely inspired by and based upon the new forms of popular music which came forth at that time. And in this modern instance of the relationship between music and civilization, it is difficult to disagree with Scott in that the music did come first, and the cultural changes afterwards, not vice versa. Can we, then, agree that music wields a force which affects the world around, a force with both a physical, namely audible, and a mystical aspect? Now, you would think controlling the movies and visual media would be the key to social control, but it's not. Music is the key. Music opens the door to the soul through the emotions. Music makes possible the visual side to seep into the subconscious. What would Star Wars as a movie look like without the music? I mean, it's the Imperial March among other tracks that breathe soul into the visuals. Aristotle wrote, "Emotions of any kind are produced by melody and rhythm. Therefore by music a man becomes accustomed to feeling the right emotions. Music has thus power to form character, and the various kinds of music based on the various modes may be distinguished by their effects on character. One, for example, working in the direction of melancholy, another of effeminacy, one encouraging abandonment, another enthusiasm, and so on through the series, self-control, another." Further in his book, David Tame writes, "For all our rejection of the philosophy of materialism, we have nevertheless failed to reject the music of materialism. Almost every form of 20th century music is utterly devoid of genuine regenerative spiritual value. The ancients may well have been correct in the belief that music patterns affect life patterns, and if so, then for a grassroots movement back towards spirituality to allow itself to continue to be subjected to the music of individuals who are of an entirely different frame of mind makes no logical sense. The minds of these performers are gross and coarse. To follow them, whilst aspiring upwards, makes no more sense than to attempt to climb a mountain by rolling downhill." Even plants respond to music. An Indonesian study concludes, "This study demonstrates that classical music can have a positive impact on plant growth and development. The findings suggest that classical music may be used as an innovative method for improving crop yields or enhancing indoor plant growth. Future studies should explore the potential application of this phenomenon in agriculture and horticulture. The increased rate of plant growth parameters by the classical music, higher plant height, higher leaf number, higher leaf weight, higher leaf area, higher root growth, higher stomatal concundance, were the conclusions of this experiment. Now, it has also apparently been shown that heavy metal, my preferred type of music, actually messes the plants up. But I'm honestly not surprised. As much as I love metal, I have always known it to be a degenerative sort of music. Now, I'm going to close off this video on a funny/sad subject, namely, how music was used by the CIA to torture prisoners. There's a Vice article describing this. The report specifically mentions that music was used as a no-touch torture device at the Cobalt detention facility. Detainees there, the report reads, were kept in complete darkness and constantly shackled in isolated cells with loud music and only a bucket to use for human waste. We know from past torture reports from Guantanamo Bay that this means that the same song or album is often played on repeat at very loud volumes to keep detainees awake for hours on end. A 2008 AP report on prisoner conditions at Guantanamo Bay said that music was used to create fear, disorient, and prolong capture shock. Not only was music used to wear down an opponent until they were broken, but the CIA also, according to the report, used specific music as a trigger to a detainee that another interrogation was about to begin. Rawhide is the only song the CIA report explicitly states was used as a torture technique. There wasn't, as far as we know, a formalized torture playlist, but in 2008, Justin Sherrick made a list of songs for Mother Jones that she learned from ex-soldiers and detainees had been used against detainees. Here are a few of them. Dope, Die, MF Die, Take Your Best Shot, Eminem, White America, and Kim. Barney and Friends theme song, Drowning Pool, Bodies, Metallica, Enter Sandman, Meow Mix, commercial jingle, and of course, Britney Spears, Baby One More Time. Thanks for listening. Go team.
Good night, Mr. Bond.
Do you expect me to talk?
No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die.